weeks. We've been refreshed, hopefully, refreshed, behind. It's been a long day at work, I know you feel. Come on, work with me, people. Take a seat. Amazing. Okay, we got beer. We've been refreshed. We're all good. Happy days. Okay, great. So, second talk. Aine Hart. Aine is the UX director and also psychologist at Sitback. And she's talking with us tonight about social influence in design research. So please make Aine welcome.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Hopefully I'll be able to give you some little nuggets and tips to bring back and use in your day-to-day. As Adam mentioned, my name is Aine. That is Aine. I'm Irish, that's how we spell it. And I'm the UX director at Sitback. I also have studied organisational psychology, which is essentially psychology for business. And I have just over 6 years experience within this area and have had the pleasure, I suppose, of working with so many different organisations in Australia, from the big banks, some of the big universities, also as well not-for-profits like the Cancer Council and Anglicare. So a real diversity of clients there. But what we find is there's a lot of similarities across what we face day to day in our projects. I think one of the things I'd like to speak to is, I suppose, how psychology fits within this user experience realm, because oftentimes people do ask us that. I think a lot of times when people hear I'm a psychologist, what they think I do is something more like this. So a lot of people go straight to that idea of counselling and blaming everything on your parents, which is not what we do. So with organisational psychology, we're really focused on psychology as applied to business. But what I would say about psychology in general is it's actually a very broad discipline. It's really about understanding how people behave, what drives their thoughts, their feelings, their actions, and then looking at ways that we can design interventions to improve those things for people. And when we think about that, that's very aligned with what user experience is, and you can really start to see the crossover there. And indeed, when you start digging on Google, you will find plenty of articles around the history of psychology and user experience together. But I suppose this is one of the insights that really speaks to me, that there are hundreds of UX best practices and principles stemming from decades of research in psychology. And this is something that you'll probably all find from your own experience, is that if you really start digging into psychology, a lot of the principles are things that you already know, you just didn't realize they came from psychological research. This can come from actually our methods themselves, so looking at usability testing that very much draws upon psychological methods of experimentation. As we were talking to earlier, the idea of measurement comes from experiment design, and that's going to be really important to us moving forward. But also things like the Gestalt principles of visual perception that a lot of visual designers learn in university. These are actually defined by psychologists, as well as things like motivational theory that influence how we design our experiences. So with all of that, I sat down and I was like, well, what am I going to speak about? I haven't got very long, so I can't go through everything as much as I love to talk. So what I thought I'd actually speak about is something that we see across projects and is particularly important when we work with enterprises. So whether that be for something customer facing or working on something where the customers are internal with the enterprise. And that is social influence. So social influence, what do I mean when I say this? This is when a person's emotions, opinions, or behaviours are influenced by the presence or the imagined or perceived presence of others. And so that's really important, is that people don't actually have to be there or expecting anything of us. We will still fall victim, I suppose, to some of these techniques or these shortcuts. It's something that we as design researchers should pay particular attention to in our research activities, both with groups and individuals, as it can influence the validity of what we get. So we really need to think about how we design our research to make sure that actually the information we get is accurate and is something that we can action and be confident that we're going to see those results when we come back to measure them later. So what I'm going to do today is actually speak to two of the most common types of these that we see all the time in the research that we do. And that is conformity and impression management. So as I speak through these, I don't think they're rocket science, but I find it's very, very helpful to have the terminology to communicate to stakeholders as to why you're defining and designing your research the way you are. Okay, so the first cab off the rank, conformity. So what we mean by conformity is when people change their beliefs or behaviour in order to fit in with a group. So this is probably something where the first time we really think about this when we're younger is probably around the peer pressure. Teenagers really exhibit this all the time in terms of wanting to see what their groups are. But it's actually something, as much as we do manage it more effectively as we get older, still affects us continuously throughout. What I'm just going to show now is a video, hopefully the sound works, to demonstrate conformity in action.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality. But little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear, and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Okay, so that's so it's a really great demonstration of just how strong this effect can be. They were all grown adults who did not realise that they were on candid camera and still behaved in a manner that I think we would all think is very strange. I know it's quite a long time ago, but I don't think lifts should have been that confusing to people then. So I suppose if we take into consideration that, we can imagine just how strong this effect can be in any research that we run. So to take it down to such a bit more of a serious note on how this applies to our day-to-day, the characteristics of conformity is that it involves a change of behaviour in order to fit in with a group, which is what we've just seen demonstrated in that video. This is actually amplified by the number of the people in the group. So I don't know if you noticed that the commentator actually spoke to the fact that we have at least 3 people in the lift. That's because they knew that that would actually increase the likelihood of the people following suit. That said, is that it can be in response not only to the presence of people, but imagined group pressure. So where I really take this into consideration, and we've seen this ourselves in working with some large enterprises, is that even in one-on-one situations, you will find that the actual context can really influence how much candid feedback you get from your participants. A really great example of this is we did some work with one of the Big 4 banks a few years ago around their internal reporting systems. Now, the people that we were interviewing actually worked with other people who had designed the current reporting systems and wanted to give really candid feedback. However, whenever we asked them whether we could record the sessions, a couple of people said no. And this really raised the point for us that actually maybe there's some, I suppose, more in-depth feedback that people had that might be something that they don't want to be seen by anyone. So rather than, we made the decision going forward in that project not to record sessions anymore, because the presence of the recording was the equivalent of having people in the room, because they worried about who was going to view those recordings. Other things to consider is that if you are doing customer feedback or customer research sessions, is whether you want to do them on site at the premises of the brand, or whether you want to make sure as well that there's no presence of the brand logo anywhere, because this will influence the type of feedback you get, because the very presence of the brand logo will affect how people speak about the product that you're going through. This is brought about by a desire to fit in or be liked. So in this case, what you'll find is oftentimes people might not give you negative feedback because they want you to like them, or it can be brought about by a need to be correct, so to not appear to have made any mistakes, or to conform to a social role. So this will be very pertinent in any scenario. So for example, if you may be doing research about something quite personal, about parenting styles perhaps, or habits in relating to gambling or alcohol, you may want to consider this even more in depth, as people will have very strong social pressures to present in a certain way. So the implications of this is that research done in a group setting is likely to underestimate diversity. So people will tend to conform to whatever the majority of the group says. So if they've had different experiences or have different opinions, they're less likely to speak up. One thing that we can do to overcome this is to actually, when we have group research, is have people think about the task or the question in hand and write things down individually before they come back and together as a group, as this will help us understand what people thought before they were influenced by others. Also that people, as I've mentioned, people do not have to be present for conformity to occur. So that can go as far as even things like surveys. So when we're doing surveys, conformity can still come through there, particularly with social norms. It's a really great story that I heard at a conference a few years ago, where one of the speakers from Google was talking about research they were doing about tablet usage. And with that tablet usage, they wanted to understand how and where people used their tablets. It wasn't, it was kind of a, well, what are they being used for? Where are the opportunities? They did have a question in there about where do you use it, and one of the options was in the bathroom. Which is something that I'm not going to ask who does it, because I understand how social conformity works. Adam, you always break the rules. But they did find that actually, in order to get an honest answer to that question, even in survey format, they either needed to make sure they didn't ask people for personal information like their name or email address, or ask for it at the end. So they've already gone through the process of answering the questions before they give their personal details, which means they're less likely to be affected by this conformity. There are multiple types of conformity. The one I wanted to focus on today is compliance. I think, given that this is an enterprise UX meetup, this is probably one that is really, really strong, particularly if you're running any workshops internally. So it might be something to do with either an internal-facing product, or it could be something that is customer-facing, but you need to get the stakeholder goals set in advance, and you're having group sessions for that. So this is where people appear to agree with others, but keep their differing opinions private. Now, I'm pretty sure we've all done this at some stage. I think we've all been in situations where you're like, that is not what I think, but now is probably not the time. And so this is something, again, that is really important to consider. I have another brief video. This one's actually some psychological research that anybody who studied a degree in psychology will be familiar with, as it's in the syllabus. It's really interesting to see it in action.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with a white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3,
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials.
Okay, so that's another great example of how we don't always show our own individual thinking. So that's something that's just factual, right? It seems really strange that you would go against the evidence that's right there in front of you. That 37%, that sounds like quite a lot to think that it happens that much. When you dig a little bit more into the statistics of this research that he did, about 75 participants conformed at least once. So that's 3/4 of people conformed with this outrageous idea at least once. So if we consider the impact of that when we're doing our research on things that are far more ambiguous most of the time, or far more based on opinion, then we can probably likely to see this happen more often. Also, if we consider when we're doing research in a work environment that there is quite a high, a high level of importance on being perceived well, we're more likely to go along with, say, people who maybe are very powerful or might be in charge of our next promotion or pay rise, then we're even more inclined to agree with what they have to say. So, looking at compliance in a little bit more depth, this one's really motivates, this is really involving public conformity while possibly keeping your own beliefs to yourself. So where I've spoken previously to conformity maybe resulting in a change of beliefs, this one's not a change in beliefs. It's something where we believe something different, but we've made the decision to present a different way. It's motivated for the need for approval and the fear of being rejected. So it's either one or the other. So it can be in chasing an incentive. So we may present in a certain way because we believe that we will get some sort of reward. This reward may not be tangible. It may just be approval from somebody who we consider to be important or powerful. Or, of course, fear of being rejected by the group. What's really key here is this stops as soon as there's no group pressures. So if this is at play in the research that we're doing, it makes our research invalid. It means those great insights that we spent so much time cultivating actually are not going to work out in the results that we're hoping to see in the product at the end. And again, it increases with the number of people present. So the real implications for this is that research done in a group setting may only represent thoughts, behaviours and beliefs of the most influential attendees. So this is where we think of the hippo in the room. What we always do is we always aim to have senior stakeholders in separate sessions on their own for 30 minutes. There's many ways you can present this to people who may not prefer to do it this way, is that they tend to be very busy people with not a lot of time, so it's better for their schedule, it's more time efficient. And also you can speak to this research and to the fact that actually we're not saying that you're an overbearing, opinionated person who pushes it on everyone else. What we're actually saying is this is human nature, and even though you may be the nicest, most egalitarian leader, and your colleagues may not even think that they're conforming, they probably are, because it can be totally unconscious and can be totally aware of it. So it makes for a really good argument to have these sort of theories to go back to, and then we can be sure, we can be more confident in the outcomes we get from our research. So moving on from conformity, I want to speak a little bit about impression management. This is something we all do. So this is something that we do in all scenarios, and it's a process in which people attempt to influence perception of others about a person, object or event by regulating information and social interactions. So that's the technical definition. What this means is that we all work really hard to get people to perceive things in the way we want them to. A lot of us, when we think about this, think about self-presentation. It's very much driven by social desirability, so we all want to be liked, so we'll present ourselves in a certain way to make sure that people, or to give us the best chances of having a positive reaction from others. What people often forget is people will do this as well about things outside of themselves. So products that they've worked on, or be an advocate. This is something we can actually leverage. So if you think of advocates for brands like Apple, people are actually managing the impressions people have of that brand by the stories they choose to tell. So the characteristics of impression management are that it's about controlling the information. So in the example I give of a brand that you really love, is that chances are you haven't had exclusively good experiences with that brand. But if you're telling somebody else about it and recommending it, you're not going to tell them about the time it didn't work. You're going to focus on the time that it did work and all the wonderful things it's done for you. And just to be aware that when we are interviewing our participants about their experiences, this may be at play. It can also be self-serving or other-oriented, what I've been speaking to, and also can be conscious or subconscious. So one of the things we probably most often get questions about from clients even in planning meetings is how do you manage for this, or how do you remove it? And I would say it's impossible to remove it completely, because we're often not even aware that we're doing it. So even if we think about the people we are most comfortable with in our lives, if you think of, say, maybe you're hanging out with your parents versus your best friends, probably not exactly the same in those two scenarios, because those people have different values and you probably show different parts of yourselves or tell different stories depending on what they are. So the implications of this is people often mask their true feelings and behaviours if they think it will not give a good impression of them. This is something we see across all the research we do. So I would say from things like usability testing, people will come in and they're there to give you feedback. They will be frightened to tell you, or they will avoid, not frightened is the wrong word, but they will avoid giving negative feedback in a lot of cases. Because really at the heart of it, they want to be liked, and their perception is that if they tell you anything bad about this thing that you've been working on, you won't like them. So even though you're like, actually I just really want to know what's not working so I don't get in trouble later, and when we do our measurement piece later on, we'll see those increases. So some things that you can do to try and avoid this is to actually, wherever possible, try and test things that you haven't designed yourself. So if you're in a team, maybe if you take turns and you make agreements that you will test the designs of your colleagues and your colleagues test your designs. If you've got a researcher in-house, that can be even better, because being able to tell people up front that I didn't design this is a great way of having them be more candid in their feedback. Other is actually to frame the fact that what I'm here for today is to find a way to improve this product. And the best way of doing that is to find out what's not working right now. Because what you've done is you've actually spun something that's considered to be negative feedback into something that's a positive. You're like, what's going to make today useful for me, and the time I've spent here is you telling me what's not working. So it's really got to encourage them to tell you that. There are other places where you'll see this impression management as play as well. As I mentioned throughout this, is people want to be seen to be knowledgeable. So oftentimes when you're doing exploratory interviews, they may decide to hold back on things that they might not be sure are correct because they don't want to be seen to be wrong. So it's really important to frame things that that they're the expert in the room and you're really interested in their opinion on that. As anybody's read Steve Portigal's book on interviewing, he gives a really great example of this, and I encourage anybody else to read it if they do have the opportunity. He talks about interviewing with around TiVo, so it's like an American TV sort of planner where you can book in and schedule what you want to watch. And they went out to a guy's house, and he does like amazing interviews, like doesn't put a time frame around it, could be all day. They went out and they were talking to this guy, and he was passionate, and you could see he really thought he was an expert on TiVo, and he was telling him all these things and all these areas to improve. And the assistant interviewer at one point piped in, because throughout this guy had been calling TiVo. And so at one point, probably about half an hour in, the assistant interviewer goes, so when you say TiVo, when you say TiVo, do you mean TiVo? And the guy shut down, because he was no longer the expert in the room. Now the assistant interviewer was the expert in the room, and he had now had his impression management went into overdrive. And he was like, well, I'm not going to say anything more because I don't want to look silly. So I think the important thing to remember is if you are running research is just ask questions. Don't feel the need to correct if you've understood what things are. And don't feel the need to explain anything during the interview. Let them speak, and you can talk to them at another time around that if needed. So But to wrap up, I'd give you some common tips that we use across our team to make sure that we're mitigating the impacts of social influence in research. As I said, you can never fully remove them, and we are social creatures. First thing I'd say is to choose your methods and venue wisely. So to reduce that effects of compliance, think about where you're going to host it. If you're having an internal team research, even if you can get to another floor, that can make a big difference, just to get people out of their normal environment. As I just told a story about, remember the participant is the expert, not the facilitator. This is not our time to shine, it's theirs. How we do our job is by asking questions and following up and listening. When organising group sessions, consider the relationships between the attendees at the group sessions. So whether that be hierarchical or also an expertise. So if you've got somebody in a group who's considered to be a real expert on a topic that you're researching, do speak to them separately, because otherwise people will defer to what they're saying. As I've told the story throughout, consider the impact of recording the sessions and whether it's something that you want to forego, particularly on internal research projects. As I said, consider whether there's an expert in the group. State up front the participant's opinion will be recorded anonymously, and do follow through on this. So we always avoid photos and names. You can talk to participant and profile, but that's where we would say to, as far as we would say to go with it. And emphasize that constructive criticism will add to the value of the session. And finally, as I mentioned in group sessions, ask participants to write down their ideas individually and share with others. If something is particularly sensitive, you might make the choice not to share it and tell them that's not going to be shared, because that way they might give you a little bit more information than what they're willing to share with the group. Okay. So thank you.
All right, time for some questions. Do we have any questions?
It's more of an observation than a question, but you know how you talked about, like, the peer pressure and not being able to speak your mind, especially when there's somebody in the room that is, as you said, influencer?
Yes.
We did a project where we worked with a customer and we made really clear to the stakeholders that we wanted to review the users, internal users. We said we really want to get them in the room, we want to speak to them, we want to get their comments, we want to do it anonymously. And they were really cool with that. And we got some really great feedback, because we're able to kind of have a little kind of like suggestion box, if you like, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
And we left the room, so to speak, and let them just write out all in the same pen, in the same post-it note colour exactly. Obviously, you could, if you wanted to be a detective about it, you could work out who was who.
Yeah.
But it gave them an opportunity to put in comments, and that was really good kind of practice. And as soon as you mentioned that, I thought, it kind of rang true with me, because that's kind of how we conducted that session.
Yeah, that's a really great approach, and especially when something's
we made it fun as
sensitive.
well. We made it so look, this is kind of like a fly on the wall stuff here. We just want you to think naturally.
Yeah. And
so it was a lot less pressure.
Did you find you got some interesting insights that you wouldn't have got
Absolutely, we got some great
otherwise?
stuff back. And when we played it back to the stakeholders, the senior stakeholders, they were blown away, because they said, look, this is great. It's great technique, because we know full well the group you were talking to, they would never have said that in an open forum.
Yeah. It's fabulous. Thank you for that.
Hi, I have a question actually about bias.
Yes.
So sorry, not so much covered what was in the presentation.
That's all right.
I'm quite curious as to how you, as a researcher or a facilitator in a research session, might manage yourself and manage your own bias when you're conducting any type of research.
Yes, this is that was the other topic I was going to go for. So I will keep this one short. I might just pick one bias, because there are so many. So confirmation bias is probably the one that we think of most commonly in ourselves as researchers. And for anyone who's not aware of confirmation bias, it's essentially where we have a tendency to pay more attention to, notice more things that we already think, and then we have more inclination to agree with that. So this is one that's really powerful, and there's nothing, even no matter how aware you are of it, you can't remove it completely. So what we do to mitigate that one is before we run our research, we look to do something we call the check-in, which again it's from Steve Porticle's book and his approach, where we get together as a team. We find it's really great to involve your stakeholders in this as well, as in terms of what we're expecting, because that keeps us honest. So when we're going through, we're at least aware of what we're looking out for. We spend a lot of time preparing our guides and having other people look over them to ensure that our questions are avoiding that leading nature that leads to bias. And we always have 2 people involved in the session. So it doesn't, I suppose, remove it totally, but at least you've got 2 different people with different bias in the room, so they'll hopefully counterbalance each other. And we also dedicate quite a bit of time to analysing. So quite a lot of time, because we're an agency, it's difficult to ensure we have time to analyse, but we'll always factor in time to go back and read through the notes, because if you work purely off your memory of the session, you're only going to remember those things you expected to see. So they're the main things that we do.
Can I add to that is encourage your note takers just to note take verbatim.
Yes.
They don't need to do any synthesis or summarization in that session. They just need to type madly as fast as they can, as for word as they can, to avoid any of that. And so that when you step away from the situation and you've got multiple people who commit that, then you can have multiple interpretations rather than just one.
Definitely, thank you for that, and that's something we practice, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, sorry, hey. So if you could choose between doing focus groups where you can easily have conformity and compliance,
Yeah.
and if you could choose to do individual studies or individual data collection or usability studies, which one would you do?
Oh, I'm going to give a real politician answer and say it depends. So I'll give you 2 examples. So I think typically I do lean towards recommending one-on-one. Even better, something contextual where you can do a bit of observation as well as interviewing. So you can look at the behaviour as well as what the elicited feedback is. Where I'd say that I would encourage groups is when you're designing a product or a tool which needs to service people with very different needs from the same tool and doesn't have much option for personalization, it can be very useful to get those different groups together and get them working on group activities together, so that you can see where they make their compromises. And then in those cases, just be aware of these effects and how they might be at play, but you'll get so much value from seeing that, then basically fight it out.
There's also a nice segue between the 2, so if you have a product or something, a feature or a function where you're trying to test it and it relies on more than one person to use it or be a key decision maker, then you can interview 2 people. So using a dyad model instead of individual, because sometimes running individual interviews is actually appropriate for what you're testing.
Yes, because you only get half the information then. So thank you.
Last question.
Just interested in your thoughts on taking these themes and translating them into the classic workshop brainstorm scenario, or working in a group.
Like in what way?
So in terms of personalities driving the direction, for example.
Yes. So one of the ways that we always look, particularly focus group workshop scenarios, is to have it very task-based and try and always start everything with a bit of internal time thinking and writing, because this does 2 things. It speaks to a lot of it helps with a lot of what's spoken to today, but also you've just spoken to those different personalities, is that extroverts are great at group sessions. They'll come in and they'll be like, oh, you asked me a question. I have so many opinions on that. Whereas introverts tend to like to think about something before they give their opinion. So by framing the workshop more so that there's time to think and write, it gives them a chance to process their thoughts before they actually articulate them. Another thing to do is always include something, no matter how tight on time you are, include a really easy question at the start and do a round robin. Because research has shown that if an introvert speaks early in a group session, they're more likely to contribute throughout it. So just a really interesting, what's your role? It's something that's just really handy so that everybody has their voice early, so it helps to mitigate that.
It's like that insight on human behaviour. That really is helpful, particularly when you're talking to a senior stakeholder about things that, they may have a really strong personality, but talking to them in a different way and saying, well, it's not you, it's what people do.
Yeah.
is a really good way to cut it.
That's it, speaking to the theory instead of making it feel like about a personal thing makes it far easier to actually run things in the way that they should be run rather than how people would like to cut time.
And running our qualitative analysis in lifts, obviously, is also another.
Yes, I love that. That's one of my favourite
I'm
videos.
so going to run in a lift next time. Thank you so much. Thank you. Aine.
Thank you.
Alright guys, that's it for the formal sort of night. So it's free to have another drink, have another beer, have another chat, do a bit more networking. The next EUX SID will be in July. We'll be doing a redux of UX London, and we'll be talking about the next Enterprise UX conference that we'll be running later in the year. Thank you very much for coming. Cheers.